Well, hello there. How's it going? My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So let's go ahead and talk about some, shall we? If you are also drawn to true crime and you want to feel better about your makeup skills, you should absolutely like, subscribe, and let's hang out together, usually every other Tuesday, where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. So how's it going? Hope the week's going well for you. As you can see, I kind of updated the set a little bit for May the 4th. Yes, total nerd. And I know May the 4th is totally past now, but I figured, for the month of May, this will be like my theme. Got all my Star Wars stuff, including my Loungefly bag. I love those Loungefly bags. They are so addictive. Oh my god, I have like 7 or 8. Anywho, let's get to today's case. And today's case it's truly sad. I mean, all true crime cases are sad, but yeah, this one's just, it really is sad. Like, there really are no winners in this case. This is a requested case, and it was requested by Tyler Manter. Yes, I've seen you. I see you. I see all the cases that you suggest. You went ahead and suggested this one. And yeah, this one was just really sad. And yeah, we've got lots to cover, so let's just dive right into it. Remember, forewarning, we are talking about true crime, so, we are, talking about, graphic content, foul language, and all that stuff, so, just be forewarned. And yeah, let's just dive into it because there's so much to get into. So as per usual, we will start off with our victim. And this is one of those cases where I don't have a whole lot of information on our victim, but of course, what we do have, we will go over. So Sandra Lee Thomas Long was born on October 18th, 1964. She was the daughter of Virginia M. and William C. Thomas. She had a brother named William G. and 2 sisters named Karen Lynn and Jean Marie, as well as a stepbrother named Gordon. And Sandra was the youngest. The youngest out of her biological siblings. Not sure about, all of her siblings. Now, friends described Sandra as just a very, good-natured type of person. She was very helpful, someone who really enjoyed helping others. She was also very, very outdoorsy and had a lot of, outdoor hobbies. Her mother, Virginia, said of her daughter, quote, "She really loved to dance and to be with her family and friends. She was just a very active person." Sandra also enjoyed horseback riding, water skiing, going to the beach, reading her pulp romance novels. She really loved children and animals, and loved raising her 2 cats. After graduating Avon Grove High School in West Grove, Pennsylvania in 1982, Sandra would end up living in the Newark, Delaware area. Now, Sandra would end up marrying a man named Gregory S. Long. And when she married Gregory, she gained a stepson named Nicholas. But I'm kind of confused on the status of their marriage at the time of the events of today's case. When they were reporting on Sandra, they didn't really report that she was married. So I don't know if they were separated, if maybe they were just living separately at that time, or what. So yeah, if you happen to know exactly, go ahead and drop that in the comments down below. I love seeing all my older videos and stuff when people are like, oh yeah, I have this information, and oh yeah, I know this or that and the other. It's really cool. So yeah, I wasn't sure if Sandra and Gregory were still married at the time of the events of today's case, but Sandra still did go by Sandra Lee Long. And another reason why I wasn't sure of her marital status is because, all the reports stated that at this point in time, after she's moved to the Delaware area and at the time of the events of today's case, Sandra was living alone at the Driftwood Apartments with her 2 cats. And this was in Price's Corner in Wilmington, Delaware. And she had lived here for about 6 months before the events of today's case. So she had lived here since about early 1994, all right? It takes place in the year of 1994. So since about early of 1994, Sandra had lived at the Driftwood Apartments by herself with her 2 cats. Now, this I'm not totally sure, but I think she may have become a registered nurse in 1994. At least her name was listed in the News Journal, which is the newspaper over there. And her name was listed. There was the name Sandra Long listed as one of hundreds of newly inducted RNs, registered nurses. And this was in the August 17th, 1994 issue of the News Journal. So not sure if she was a registered nurse because none of the other subsequent reports on Sandra mention this fact. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was just another Sandra Long that lived in Wilmington, Delaware. Not sure. Again, if you happen to know, let me know. But I do know that Sandra had worked as a data entry clerk, a waitress, and even a saleswoman. And at the time of the events of today's case, Sandra's family insists that she was about 4 to 5 months pregnant. And we will get into why I phrase it like that. And yeah, so unfortunately, that's kind of really all I know about Sandra, you know? It's just how it is sometimes, right? You just don't have a lot of information in general about, you know, either the victim or the perpetrator, you know? And that's kind of what this case is. So let's get into our perpetrator. And, yeah, kind of like with Sandra, don't have a whole lot of information about him. But yeah, let me share with you what I did find. So, Brian David Steckel. All right, let's get into him. Brian David Steckel was born on December 14th, 1968 in Allenstown, Pennsylvania. His mother was Marlene A. Renninger Steckel, and his father was Robert C. Steckel. Now, I know, again, some of the information was just not super clear, so yeah, let me know if I get any of the following information wrong. So I know Brian had a brother named Robert Jr., and then I know at some point, Marlene and Brian's father divorced and Marlene remarried, and she remarried a man who would end up becoming Brian's stepfather, Willie P. Edwards, or maybe it's Wiley P. Edwards. It has one L, W-I-L-E-Y. So I wasn't sure if that was just an alternative spelling of Willie, or if it was Wiley. But either way, Marlene would marry Wiley/Willie and become Marlene Edwards. And then Brian would end up having 3 half-brothers, Willie/Wiley Jr., Ronnie and Eric. And then he would also end up having 2 younger half-sisters as well. And they were named Tina and Patsy. Now, it appears Brian mainly grew up in the Fountain Hill, Pennsylvania area. And it seems he may have been born with maybe perhaps some neurological problems, not quite sure what exactly, but I think he may have been a little developmentally delayed. Again, I don't really have a whole lot of nitty-gritty details on that, just that he was definitely born with some sort of like neurological problems, which I feel just really just adds to the sadness of this whole thing. I do know that Brian was a 12th grade dropout, and he moved around quite frequently, never really having a stable address. I think that's one of the reasons it's just kind of hard to get any information on him is, yeah, he kind of lived a transient lifestyle a little bit. He had numerous jobs over the years, but he was never really able to like stick with one job. He would always end up getting fired and losing these jobs. He worked as a cook at Dempsey's Restaurant in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and was employed by numerous moving companies throughout the New Castle County, Delaware area. I'm not sure when he kind of migrated over to Delaware, but he would end up kind of bouncing back and forth between Delaware and Pennsylvania. And yeah, in Delaware, he was employed by a lot of moving companies, even Mayflower Moving, but yeah, again, he would end up getting fired from all these jobs. I don't have any other details about like why he was fired or anything like that, just that he was never able to hold down a steady job. And in April of 1987, Brian would run afoul of the law, as it were. He was arrested on charges of theft and receiving stolen property. And apparently this was just one of many times that he would be arrested and charged. Unclear if this was his first run-in with the law. So yeah, Brian definitely ends up I guess in and out of jail, in jail permanently, not sure. I don't have a lot of nitty-gritty details. The next information that I was able to find came from 1990 when Brian was in jail. Don't know if he was on jail related to those 1987 charges or had gotten arrested on something else, not sure. But in 1990, Brian was a 21-year-old inmate, specifically a inmate at the Lehigh County Jail, or prison. And he was an inmate there. And in 1990, he wrote a letter to the local paper called The Call. And in it, he wrote how he and some of the other prisoners had helped raise money for a woman who needed a heart transplant. And he also informed them that they had undergone tests to see if they would be matches for a 6-year-old who needed bone marrow. In this letter, he partially wrote, quote, "I come from a middle-class family, a family that always was out to help others. Over the years, I took a lot out of our community. I stole from people all my life, my family, friends, and from strangers. And my way of making amends is to help all that are in need." So, don't really have any other information about Brian's movements after this. I do know that he would end up having a daughter in 1993. Her name was Megan Navarre, but I have no other details other than that. I do know that Brian had a girlfriend who was only referred to as Donna. I don't know if that was a pseudonym or what, but that's what I will be calling her. So Brian would have an on-again, off-again girlfriend named Donna. I do not believe she is Megan's mother. But I know Brian would end up living on and off with Donna and her little boy in different apartment complexes throughout Delaware. And neighbors would end up having the same story to tell, that Brian was unfortunately violent, was an alcoholic, and he and Donna would fight very loudly, sometimes even yelling at her little boy. When he lived with Donna and her son in Dorjewel Apartments, which was northwest of Wilmington, neighbors said that they constantly heard Brian yelling and arguing with Donna. One anonymous neighbor said, quote, "We were afraid he was going to kill her. He used to brag he was an ex-con and show us his tattoos that he said meant something in prison. He wasn't a nice person. He was a very scary guy." Yeah, right? Certainly a different Brian than the one who wrote that 1990 letter, right? In 1992, after Brian and Donna had broken up, he returned to the Newark apartment that they shared, and he stole Donna's computer. And after this, apparently, the only information I could find said that Donna had moved out and moved into a shelter for battered women, I'm assuming with her son. And later, I'm guessing Donna probably pressed charges, but Brian ended up pleading to a lesser charge of misdemeanor theft. And he was sentenced to a year's probation. And apparently in this plea bargain agreement, there was a letter in the file from the Attorney General's office stating that Brian had no prior felony or misdemeanor convictions or charges. And on a form he had to complete, Brian listed his entire criminal history as Las Vegas, Nevada assault, specifically misdemeanor assault. So, yeah, again, not a lot of information on Brian. These were just, little bits that were reported in newspaper articles. And like I said, I believe Brian and Donna would continue to be an on-again, off-again couple. I know in 1994, he was sometimes staying with her in an apartment in Ellesmere. And unfortunately, I also know that Brian's violent behavior did not stop. On February 10th, 1994, he was charged with third-degree assault and harassment, but those charges would end up getting dismissed in the Court of Common Pleas in March of that same year, and there were no other details about that I could find. However, on February 18th, barely a week after that February 10th incident, Brian was charged with offensive touching after punching a bartender named Francis Callahan, and this was outside Comiggy's pub. And Francis said Brian jumped him from behind after Francis had asked him to stop spitting popcorn kernels all over the floor. And after Brian failed to show up for a hearing in relation to this charge in August of that year, Wilmington Municipal Court issued an arrest warrant for Brian, of course, right? But because he's, kind of a transient and never really had a stable place of residence or employment, it's kind of hard to find him. And that's really all the background information I have on Sandra and Brian. Like I said, not really a whole lot. Those are the details that are available. Sometimes that's just how it is, right? So let's get to the date of the incident. So on Friday, September 2nd, 1994, at around noon, Brian knocked on 29-year-old Sandra's door. He had actually recently been staying at the Driftwood apartments with a friend, the Johnsons. It was Robert Johnson, his wife Tammy, and their 4-year-old son. And Brian sometimes crashed there. They lived on the ground floor in the opposite corner of Building B where Sandra lived. From descriptions, it sounded like they may have lived like maybe across from her. But anyway, Brian knocks on Sandra's apartment door and asks to use her phone. And Sandra says, of course, and lets him in. He had asked to use her phone once before and had, so that's probably why Sandra let him in, right? But unfortunately, instead of going to the phone to use it, Brian disconnected it and then demanded that Sandra sleep with him. And when she refused, he overpowered her and covered her mouth with his hand so she couldn't scream. And in response, Sandra bit his hand really hard. And in response to that, Brian then stabbed her in the hand, I believe it was like in the web of her thumb, with a screwdriver that he had brought with him. He had taken it from the Johnsons' apartment. Brian then threw Sandra to the couch, overpowering her, and attempted to strangle her with a pair of pantyhose that he had brought with him. Again, he had taken them from the Johnsons' apartment. But when he was in the middle of strangling Sandra, the pantyhose ripped. So instead, he grabbed a tube sock that was nearby and strangled Sandra into unconsciousness with that. And after he had strangled her to unconsciousness, Brian then sexually assaulted Sandra. Some reports state that he sexually assaulted her anally as well. And some reports also indicate that Brian also sodomized Sandra with the screwdriver. Oh, that's just awful, dude. Like, oh, it gets so much worse. It gets so much worse. So after he was done assaulting Sandra, he dragged her to her bedroom and threw her on her bed. And then he proceeded to light the bedspread on fire. He then went into the bathroom and started another fire in there by lighting the curtains on fire. Sandra was still alive when Brian set these two fires and then left her apartment. The fire would end up being reported at 12:20 p.m., and the fire that would end up engulfing Sandra's apartment was very intense. It was a nasty, nasty fire. And, oh, this is so sad. Several passersby would try to help Sandra and try to rescue her. Oh my God! Like, yeah, we'll get into it. It's so sad. So some passersby, right, could see this fire, and they could see a woman in the window through her bedroom window. And these would-be rescuers attempted to like bash the glass of her bedroom window and like pull her to safety. But unfortunately, like the flames like were just spitting out and were so hot, and poor Sandra was engulfed in flames. Like, it was so hot they like couldn't even grab her. Quote, they couldn't reach in. Her skin was all on fire. They couldn't get her out. It was awful. And this was according to Sandy Holzman. And she was one of about a half dozen people who tried to rescue and help Sandra. Another would-be rescuer was named Tony Breslin. And he said, quote, I could see her hand. We just couldn't reach it. The flames were coming out. He was a neighbor who actually lived down the hall from Sandra, and he had occasionally spoken to her. And he described what he encountered when everything went down. Quote, I heard this boom, so I ran out in the hall and I saw nothing but black smoke, dense black smoke. Tony said that he saw down the hallway into Sandra's apartment, the door was open and there was just like all kinds of black smoke just pouring out of it. And as he looked and saw that, he saw that there was a man crawling on his hands and knees into the apartment. And Tony thought it may have been, he described it as Sandra's boyfriend. He thought it was a man that he had seen Sandra with quite often. Maybe it was Gregory, her husband. Like, yeah, again, not quite sure. As far as like marital status, relationship status goes, not quite sure about that. But that's who Tony thought it was. And Tony said the man, quote, was hollering at her to get out. He was hollering at her to crawl over the floor to where he was in the doorway. All she could say was, please help me, please help me. Now it turns out this man was actually named John Hall. And he and his coworker, Lane Randolph, were tree trimmers. And they were actually driving by when, they saw the fire start, So they had pulled over to try and help. John said that he kicked the door into Sandra's apartment and he crawled through the smoke to try to like get to her, and he could hear her screaming for help. Quote, I felt like I was in total hell. It was dark and there were flames everywhere. And he said at one point, Sandra stumbled to him like through a wall of fire. But that's when John directed her to her window because that was the nearest opening near her. So he told her like, oh no, go to the window, go to the window. Meanwhile, after Tony got his wife Marianne out of the building, he ran around the side of the building, the side of the building that had Sandra's bedroom window. And that's when he and a few others, including John's coworker, Lane Randolph, tried to bash in the glass to Sandra's bedroom. And when they finally managed to break the glass, Lane said that he like reached through the window and like he could feel the heat, you know? He felt like the hair on his arm singe off. And he, you know, reached through trying to grab Sandra's hand. And even though like he was able to grab it, at least for one point in time, quote, the room was totally black with smoke. Smoke and heat were pouring out. I pulled with all my might, but I just couldn't pull her to safety. And as Tony and the others were like in the middle of doing that, like I think at that point they were trying to like bash through the window, an unidentified screaming woman went screaming into the street and flagged down the very first car that she saw, begging them to call 911. And that happened to be Sandy Hulsman and her friend Cindy Funk. The ladies had just taken their children to Arby's and were driving back home when this unidentified woman, like, started, you know, like, oh my God, call 911. And, luckily, I guess, Sandy had a car phone at this time. Like, that's gotta be super rare. This is 1994. But she had a car phone at this time. And so, Cindy called 911 and the fire department and all that, while Sandy went to run and help the men who at that point were trying to bash through Sandra's bedroom window. Sandy said when she first got to the window, she could see Sandra. Quote, she was sitting on something at first and we were yelling at her to come toward the window. And, you know, Sandy said that Sandra did manage to make it to the window. But at that point, like, most of her body was engulfed in flames. Quote, she was out of her mind at that point. Cindy added, quote, the men started taking their clothes off to wrap it around their hands to try to get to her. John came running out of the building at that point, hoping to see Sandra get out of her window. But at that point, yeah, it was just too late, even though they had bashed the glass and had even, you know, reached onto Sandra. It was just too late at that point. Tony said John threw himself against a trash can when he was told that, yeah, Sandra, like, she collapsed to the floor. We couldn't save her. Quote, he said it was too late. Cindy saw John later and said, quote, he was over there by the pole crying. And Sandy said, quote, she was right by the window. Right by the window. I mean, isn't that awful? Like, they had her right there. She was right there at the window. They even grasped her hand, but she was just too far gone at that point. It was just too hot. She was fully engulfed in flames. That is such an awful, awful way to die. And to top it off, one of Sandra's cats also perished in the fire with her. And by the time firefighters got on the scene, the flames were just like, yeah, leaking out of the broken glass. Like, the fire was full on raging. Fire departments from 4 companies responded, along with county paramedics and 2 Delaware state police officers who were from the Price's Corners barracks. They were like right near the apartment building. Firefighter Drew Beedman, I would assume that's how you say his name, from Cranston Heights Fire Company, recalled how by the time firefighters got on scene, there was nothing they could do for Sandra. It was just kind of like too little too late. Quote, we had no chance to save her. He talked about just how hot the fire was when they got on scene. So apparently a firefighter's black coat will turn red when it experiences temperatures of 700 degrees Fahrenheit and turns yellow when it experiences temperatures of 900 degrees Fahrenheit. And Beedman said after fellow firefighter Gene Bledsoe had crashed through Sandra's apartment and then had exited back out, his coat had patches of both colors on the left side, and there were even, like, holes burned into the material, which, you know, remember, it's a firefighter's jacket. A material's supposed to be indestructible. Quote, he was steaming when he came out and he fell down. I thought we'd lost him too. Firefighter Dennis Hitchens, Bledsoe's partner, said the fire, quote, was blowing out the window at us. And Hitchens would actually be the one to find Sandra's body. And yeah, as you can imagine, it was burned beyond belief. Quote, I checked her, tried for a pulse, but I could tell by the way her arm fell after I lifted it that she was gone. You can't print what I think about the person who set that fire. And John said that after the fire was out, he went and looked and he saw Sandra's body. Quote, she was just folded like a flower in a microwave. She was just melted. Now, after they had extinguished the fire, firefighters initially told the press that they were going to have to do like a thorough investigation because like the fire was so hot and like burned so rapidly that they couldn't immediately tell like what caused this? Was this arson? Was this an accident or what? Like they couldn't even tell. And yeah, they were going to have to do a very thorough investigation. Quote, we're going through everything with a fine-tooth comb. When there's a death involved, you have to be very careful and eliminate every possibility. And this was according to Assistant Chief Deputy Fire Marshal Willard F. Preston III. A few people did have to be sent to Christiana Hospital for smoke inhalation, including a neighbor of Sandra's was an elderly woman named Marjorie Arden. And an unidentified state trooper also had to be taken to the hospital for smoke inhalation. And a firefighter, again, unidentified firefighter, also had to go to that hospital for an injured wrist. It would ultimately be ruled that Sandra died of smoke inhalation and that over 60% of her body was burned. And an initial autopsy missed bruising on her jaws and buttocks. And there were disputes on whether or not Sandra was pregnant at the time of her death, because neither autopsy could find any evidence that she was pregnant or with child, but her family insists, like, no, like, she was 4 to 5 months pregnant. Like, she was telling us, she was excited. Like, no, the fire must have, like, burned away any evidence that she was pregnant. And so, yeah, I'm curious if you happen to know, like, is that possible? Can a fire do that? Like, be so intense, just completely erase any trace that you were carrying a child? But yeah, I mean, like, I feel like we can believe Sandra's family. That's a pretty silly thing to lie about. And like 4 or 5 months, like, yeah, like you would have surely told people by then, right? And like, yeah, she would have told her family. But yeah, I just thought that was like very odd. So let's get back to Brian here. All right, let's follow his movements after he set the fire that killed Sandra. So after he left Sandra's apartment, he went to the nearby home of a friend and former coworker. This coworker's name was Larry Day, and he lived there with his wife, Maria. So Brian's hanging out, and Larry ends up leaving the home. And when he's gone, Brian asks Maria to drive him to the liquor store, and Maria agrees. Now, Maria ended up taking a route to the liquor store that took them right by Sandra's apartment complex, which at that moment, right, was fully engulfed in flames. And so as Maria was driving past officers that were directing traffic at that time, Maria said that Brian ducked down in his seat and pulled like his baseball cap that he was wearing like over his head. And she said he seemed like nervous and angry. Quote, I said, you're acting like you killed someone. And Brian just laughed at her. So hours after he had set the fire and killed Sandra, at about 4:15 p.m., Brian then called the newspaper the News Journal. And it would be the first of 4 times that he would call the paper, identifying himself each time as the Driftwood Killer. So his first phone call was to Assistant City State Editor Herb J. Pinder. Now, Brian did not identify himself or Sandra by name, but just told Herb in obscene language how he had sexually assaulted a woman and set her on fire. And when Herb asked him if he was afraid of being caught, Brian responded with a bunch of obscenities before saying, quote, I want to die. Now, Herb knew about Sandra's death because, like, the details about it were already on the radio, except for, of course, at that point in time, Sandra hadn't been publicly identified yet. So it was just the story, right, of, like, a woman who had died in a fire. And so, like, Herb was like, okay, I wonder if this was a crank call, which wouldn't be unheard of, right? Like, the story just broke, and, like, newspapers get all kinds of wackadoodles who call and say all kinds of things, right? Brian called the paper again at 7:30 that same evening. I do not know when the other 2 calls were. I could only find information about these 2 calls. So Brian calls the paper again, 7:30, and this time he gets reporter Nan Clements. She said she got a call from a man, quote, who claimed he had murdered a woman earlier that day. She said that he then proceeded to say that he had found his next victim, and he named her as a woman named Susan Gell. Or maybe it's Gell. It's Gell. Gel or gel, not sure. Quote, I could hear a pool table in the background. It sounded as if he was on his way to getting pretty well drunk. Now, after he had identified Susan by name, the paper thought that they should probably call the police. Especially if it could potentially save the life of a woman, right? Quote, somebody's life could have been at stake, and this was according to the paper's executive editor, John Walston. So the editor alerted the Newcastle authorities, who were then able to identify and find Susan, right? So they found Susan and questioned her. It just so happened Susan was engaged to a Wilmington police officer, and she told these officers that she had been receiving, quote, very lurid, very sexual phone calls. And they had started the previous month, lasting from about August 2nd to August 13th. And so with the help of her fiance, of course, they were able to trace the calls to Brian, and then Susan had pressed charges against him. And when the police dug even further into Brian, they came up with a mugshot that was related to like some other previous minor charges that he had. And they also discovered that 6 other women had filed similar complaints to Susan's against Brian. And all these women said that, yeah, Brian called them with very sexual, obscene phone calls, and the calls had started after they had recently moved. So that Friday night, as fire investigators, worked the crime scene at Sandra's apartment complex, police were on the lookout for Brian. And they were checking out, all of his usual haunts that he hung out with, right? Pool halls and stuff like that. Police did manage to track down Brian's last 4 physical addresses that they could find, but every time they went, they were informed that Brian had no longer lived there. And right, that's what makes it so difficult to find him. He kind of has like a transient type lifestyle. So yeah, he's not in any one place for too long, it seems. Now, at this point in time, all right, when police are looking for Brian, they do not think Sandra's murder and Brian's calls to the paper were related. They believe that Brian was for sure an obscene phone caller. He obviously, wasn't totally normal, but they didn't really think he was a killer, And so that's one of the reasons that police did not alert the press or the local news that they were searching for Brian, because they didn't want to start any undue panic. And they said that they didn't want to provoke Brian into doing something else or encourage copycats or something. And I guess around this time, police were especially sensitive to public sentiment because a serial sexual assaulter, his name was Michael Francis Sipple, had recently been caught. And his crimes had dated back all the way to 1989. So yeah, he had just been caught. So, everyone was kind of on edge, right? Been gotten away for, all these years with these crimes. So that was another reason why the police were very, very sensitive to what they told the public. Another reason why police didn't really alert the press is because they knew even when they found Brian, there wasn't a whole lot they could charge him with. Yeah, can you believe it? At that point in time, there wasn't a lot that they could charge him with. And that's because Brian hadn't physically harmed any of these women he had called, right? And even though, get this, even though Brian had told the newspaper Susan's name, the name of her apartment complex, where she lived, and threatened that he was going to sexually assault and kill her too, no other laws were broken because Brian had made these threats to a third party, in this case being the News Journal. Isn't that wild? And even though Brian had left a voicemail on one of these women he had called threatening to harm her, yeah, that was still, I guess, not enough of a crime or something. And so that was another reason police were well, we don't really want to alert the press because there's not even really a whole lot we can do with this guy, And then over at the News Journal, they were also kind of contemplating oh, do we talk about this Brian guy? Do we not? Is he just sort of a crank caller? Is he something? What should we do? Quote, we didn't know for sure that this guy was connected. Maybe he was seeking publicity. I'm not interested in starting a panic in our community by saying a serial killer is on the loose, and that was according to Walston. He said that there was a lively debate in the editor's room about keeping this from the public, but Walston insisted, quote, a lot of people call here making outrageous claims all the time. We don't print what they say. He told us who his next victim was. By that time, the police had found her. We knew she was safe. From that standpoint, I knew there was no need to unduly alarm the populace. There was some concern that we were hiding something. I knew some would say the News Journal was withholding information. My argument was, it wasn't news yet. said. If we had known in any clear way that this guy was connected to the crime, we would have run it. Until that connection was established, we couldn't run it. Isn't that a foreign concept today? A newspaper actually taking care about the things that they publish and print? What? Meanwhile, after a 14-hour investigation by fire marshals, they, of course, were able to determine that the fire set in Sandra's apartment had been intentionally set. Quote, the fire was intentionally lighted using an open flame and a flammable or combustible material. We reached that conclusion after ruling out all possible accidental causes, and this was according to Assistant Chief Fire Deputy Preston. And they were also able to ascertain that the fire started on the bedspread and the bathroom, specifically from the bathroom curtains. And they were also able to tell that it had been ignited either by a match or a lighter. Investigators would also end up finding spots of what would eventually be identified as Brian's blood in the hallway and on Sandra's door. Brian would finally be apprehended and arrested around 2:30 a.m. on Saturday, which is September 3rd. And he was picked up at the corner of 3rd and Union Streets in Wilmington. And he was spotted and apprehended by Newcastle County Patrolman Michael McGowan. So McGowan had noticed there was this drunken man at this intersection right here, and he saw that there was a tattoo on the guy's forearm named Ashley, and all the reports that police had about keeping an eye out for Brian had said he had had this tattoo on his forearm of the name Ashley. And so, McGowan, approached him and kind of, figured out it was Brian. And Brian was he was intoxicated, all right? He was drunk. And so McGowan made Brian think that he was going to give him a break on a public drunkenness charge and drive him home. But instead, McGowan drove him to the police station. And in the end, Brian was apprehended without incident. But he was so drunk that, officers couldn't even question him. They had to put him in the drunk tank to sober up. He was described as being incoherent and out of it. So he spent most of that Saturday, sleeping off the alcohol at the Newcastle County Police Station. Police also noticed that Brian sported a nasty, nasty bite to his right index finger. And remember, they were able to arrest Brian because Susan had pressed charges against him, right? So that's, what they were looking for him for, right? However, apparently, the charges that Susan could press him for were super minor. It wasn't a felony, wasn't a misdemeanor or anything. It was the type of the seriousness or the level of the charge was described as being equivalent to a fine. Yeah, can you believe that? I believe they said it was more like a violation, So that meant in legal terms, it was super, super minor as far as the courts and the law were concerned. Yeah, it was like a parking ticket. So as Brian slept off the alcohol, investigators continued working Sandra's case. And at about 9 a.m. that Saturday morning, they discovered that Brian had been staying at the Driftwood apartments. And even though this was small, this was the first independent link that connected Brian and Sandra outside of his own boasting, right? So it was kind of a big deal. So the next morning when he woke and was sober, Brian waived his Miranda rights, and then he confessed to what he had done. He admitted that he had entered Sandra's apartment with the sole intent to kill her. Quote, because I felt like it. He said he set the fire to her bedspread and the curtains because it was, quote, something different, man, excitement. I watched the flames and I walked out. Newcastle County Police Sergeant John Downs said of Brian's confession, quote, he said that he was an animal and this wasn't the first time he had killed. And he believed Brian, quote, had thought about committing a murder for a long time. We got him relatively early in his career. This was something he'd worked at. Downs said that he detected a, quote, a sense of excitement that he had done what he dreamed about. And Brian himself even told the police that he was a messed up person. Quote, I was a redhead. People taunted me. People did shit to me. You know what I mean? Pushing me aside, step on me. I got tired of that, man. I just fought back. My family loved me, and now they're scared of me because they made me this way. The family, the system, society. And at one point in the interrogation/confession, Brian asked the detectives, quote, don't you get tired of dealing with people like me? Can't you see I'm worthless? I mean, why are you wasting time on me? And Downs responded that they had to figure out what was going on, and that's when Brian snapped, quote, I fucking killed somebody. What the fuck do you mean what's what's going on. Now, throughout his confession, Brian would change his story several times. He said he chose Sandra as a victim because she was pretty, and because she had refused to sleep with him or smoke weed with him. He then claimed that he and Sandra had consensual sex in the days leading up to her murder, and that she may possibly be pregnant with his child. He then claimed that she was demanding support payments. And then at one point, when he was sitting in jail, he would tell a prison official that Sandra started the whole altercation that day by hitting him with a frying pan. And this was after accusing him of stealing drugs from her. During his confession, Brian said he met her through a, quote, sleazy thing in the neighborhood, but then retracted that, saying, quote, "She's not sleazy, man. I took her fucking life, man. She didn't deserve to die. There's something wrong with me, inside of me, and I just go off the fucking handle, man. And it's just not right. You know what I mean? I guess now I finally got stopped." And he also boasted that he had killed others. He claimed to have killed 4 victims in Delaware and 2 in Pennsylvania, telling Sergeant Downs, quote, "I'm an animal. I hurt anybody, man. Been hurting people for a long time. If you let me walk out the door, I'd go do it again." Additionally, Brian told police where he stashed the pantyhose, the lighter, and the screwdriver. And the next day, they found them at the Day's place, Larry and Maria Day's home. Brian would end up being charged with first-degree murder, second-degree burglary, first-degree arson, and first-degree unlawful sexual intercourse. On Monday, September 5th, police announced that they had arrested Brian for Sandra's murder, and this is when they detailed to the public many of the facts that we already went over. Brian was being held without bail, and this was due to a state law that forbid bail for first-degree murder charges. However, I guess, Brian could still seek bail on the other charges, which just seems so weird to me. That seems odd. It seems like, okay, well, if you're saying, first-degree murder charges can't get bail, who cares if he's charged with other charges? You know what I mean? I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something. Wouldn't be the first time. Lieutenant James R. Hedrick, who was the county officer in charge of the investigation, told the press that police, quote, probably would have questioned Steckel as a resident of the complex. Lieutenant Hedrick updated the press on what led to Brian's arrest, including that Brian did confess, but he wouldn't go into detail. Quote, "The only thing I can tell is our investigation led us to believe he was the individual responsible for setting that fire and thus causing her death." He also stated that due to a state law, they could not release Brian's mental health record or prior criminal record. Robert Johnson, remember the guy who Brian was staying with? He also spoke to the press on Monday. He said he had only tried to do a guy a favor, and instead ended up with all the neighbors, quote, looking at me like I was the scum of the earth. He insisted that Brian, quote, seemed like a nice guy. No one knew he was sick. And he made it clear that Brian did not live with them because that's what the press reported, but that he had, quote, spent one night and left, and then a couple of weeks later, he spent another. And he was really, really shaken up at the fact that he had a killer in his home. I mean, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you? That would be the ultimate mindfuck. Quote, "My wife just asked me, are we that bad judges of character? No wonder people moved to the country." I mean, yeah, wouldn't that would have you questioning all of, your choices, right? You'd be like, wait a minute, maybe I'm not a good judge of character. I know that would definitely screw with me. And I already have trust issues. I can't imagine if I had found myself in this situation. Robert told the press that at first, Brian did live at the complex with his girlfriend, Donna, and they lived in Building C, but Donna ended up moving to Colorado. Quote, "For a while, he was living there in the empty apartment." Robert said that Brian then stayed with another neighbor in the complex for a night or two, and, quote, would just turn up and hang around. Robert stated that Brian said he had planned to move to Colorado, and he told the press, and the police, of course, that Brian had left a single-packed bag at his apartment, which of course the police confiscated. And Robert reiterated that he never, ever in a million years would have let Brian into his home around his wife and child if he had any idea that Brian had this kind of violence in him. On Tuesday, September 6th, Brian had another charge added to his roster, and this was stemming from an incident that occurred on August 11th. So apparently he shouted threats and obscenities and all kinds of messed up stuff to a woman named Patricia Medina. And she lived in the same Ellesmere apartment complex that Brian did with Donna and her boy. And so as a result, charges of harassment and disorderly conduct were tacked on. And they were tacked on when he made his first court appearance at the Magistrate Court 18 at Gander Hill Prison. And this was, of course, in Wilmington. And he was here for a bail review on those lesser charges. And of course, right, bail was denied. So Patricia spoke to the press about what had happened that August 11th. And she told the press a lot of what other neighbors had said about Brian, that he was violent and he was an alcoholic. Quote, when he drinks, he's violent. I could hear him yelling at his girlfriend and her little boy, and sometimes I'd hear him breaking furniture. She said Brian had shouted like threats and obscenities at her twice before this incident on August 11th, but she had always ignored it because, like, right, she didn't want to engage, right? But this third time on August 11th, Brian had harassed her on the stairway as she was entering her apartment, and Patricia decided that, like, she'd had enough, and so she decided to call 911. And 2 days later, in her police report that she filed with the police, she wrote, quote, this is the third time he's done this to me. Sometimes I'm afraid to come into my apartment in case he carries out his threats. Now, Ellesmere police did show up to the complex to talk to Brian, after Patricia had filed her report. But at that point in time, he was gone, and Patricia said that she never saw him again. Police also wouldn't release a photo of Brian until that Tuesday because they wanted time for any other, potential victims or something to come forward. Sandra's memorial was held on Wednesday, September 7th, and she was buried at St. George's Cemetery. Virginia, her mother, said, quote, I miss her terribly, and so does everybody else. I feel like this is a nightmare that just won't go away. On Thursday, September 8th, Brian pled guilty to the charges surrounding Patricia, and he was scheduled to appear on the charges related to Sandra the next week in the very same court. And on September 14th, a grand jury indicted Brian on all of the charges related to Sandra's murder. And so right now the waiting process begins, right? As he goes through courts and to his trial date and all that stuff, right? So Brian is he's in jail, right? He's locked up. And as he's locked up, Brian would end up writing several letters, 75 actually in total. Yeah, 75 letters Brian would write from prison as he's awaiting trial. And he sent these letters to various people, including newspapers, police, Virginia, Sandra's mother, female real estate agents for some weird reason, and to a Deputy Attorney General, Timothy H. Barron, who would end up prosecuting this case. Brian also sent letters to various court employees and even sent a letter to Maria Day. And so now let's get a little bit into some of these letters that Brian sent off because they are certainly unhinged. So in June 1995, Brian sent a letter to Pennsylvania police and newspapers claiming that he had killed more victims. The letter was sent to Fountain Hill, Pennsylvania Police Chief Wallace Skeeter Fry. And Brian sent an accompanying letter to the Allenstown, Pennsylvania newspaper, and that was called the Morning Call. And in these letters, Brian claimed to have sexually assaulted, strangled, and killed another victim. It was a Fountain Hill resident named Francis Kiefer. And he said that he was a neighbor of his mother's, and it was true. Marlene and Francis were friends. And Francis has been missing since March 22nd, 1994. And yeah, at the time, Marlene and Francis were friends. They actually lived right around the corner from each other. And Brian said that when he killed Francis, at that time he was living in Delaware, but he had killed her on one of his return visits home. Quote, the only person that will identify Franny is the dentist, I'll tell you. He offered to lead authorities to her remains, telling Police Chief Fry that he killed Francis as a vendetta against him. Quote, me and Skeeter got unsettled business and I got all the answers. Chief Fry was kind of boggled by all this, and he said, quote, he said I was the first officer to put handcuffs on him, but I don't even know what it was for. Brian also claimed to have left fingerprints on Francis's tire and car door. He also claimed to have had a sexual affair with Francis, who was 44 when she disappeared and was a notorious recluse. Brian also stated that he liked older women and had liked older women since he was 15. Francis's son, Adam, was completely blown away by Brian's admission. Quote, I'd never in a million years pick Brian Steckel to do something to my mom. And he was saying that with Brian's childhood and past criminal history, he was definitely dangerous, but he still was kind of skeptical of Brian's claims. Quote, I'm wondering why he would claim to do this. I think it's possible that he could also want attention. He stated that his mother did not really know or trust Brian enough to leave voluntarily with him, and Adam was thinking that his mother had left voluntarily. Lehigh County District Attorney Robert Steinberg didn't put a whole lot of stock into Brian's claims. Quote, some aspects make it plausible, but Mr. Steckel has some credibility problems. He's laid claims to other crimes he could not have committed. Brian had claimed to have killed a 15-year-old Pennsylvania girl delivering newspapers, and he thought her name was Patricia or Atricia. He also said he attacked a woman named Michelle in Delaware, specifically near the Women's Correctional Institution on US 13, and he said that this was near Newcastle, Delaware. He also claimed his very first victim was a woman in Jacksonville, Florida, and his second victim was a woman in Portland, Maine. He claimed to have killed someone in Las Vegas, Nevada as well, writing, quote, I couldn't stop. It was like a shot of heroin or crank. The rush was intense. Meanwhile, Pennsylvania State Police spokesman Sergeant Michael Credler told the press, quote, he did write a letter. We're checking it out. Marlene, Brian's mother, could only say of the letters, quote, oh my goodness, how in the heck did this take place? In another letter, not sure to who, but in one of the many letters Brian wrote, he talked about how much he liked killing and how much he liked how his victims looked when he killed them. Quote, I don't care if I'm executed. I don't care. I stopped caring once I had to fend for myself. I didn't just wake up and say I'm gonna kill. No, I wanted to kill. I plot, I stalked, and I found prey. And the thing that I enjoyed was the prey's eyes. Now, if you want reality, to me, it's death. I'm going to die for my actions against mankind, but it's about the eyes, the frightened eyes. Did you ever see death? Well, if you haven't, I have. It's real. To me, it was a game of cat and mouse, but I never gave my prey a chance to win. I was a loser all my life. He said he left a piece of evidence behind every murder by branding his prey by biting them on the buttocks. However, despite his boasting and whatnot, police were never ever able to link Brian with any other crimes in Pennsylvania, Delaware, or any other state. Quote, our investigation is still open, so we won't rule anything out, but we've checked out all his allegations, and we have been unable to substantiate any of them. And this was according to Pennsylvania State Police Detective Lieutenant Theodore Cahuth, who was investigating Francis's disappearance. Quote, Mr. Steckel certainly has a credibility problem. And then the 15-year-old delivering newspapers that Brian claimed to have killed or thought her name was Patricia or Tricia, yeah, they knew that he didn't do that because they had the killers of that girl in custody, and police were pretty certain that they did it because of DNA evidence that they had. And Sergeant Downs said that they could find, no murders of a Patricia or a Tricia in Pennsylvania or a Michelle in Delaware. They couldn't find anything. Downs said that when he informed Brian of this fact, he admitted that he had just made it up. Quote, then he said he never killed anybody else. He said he had made up the stuff about the other killings. Brian told him, quote, I was just shooting the breeze, man, and I was drunk when I was saying that. I never killed anyone else. In a letter to Attorney General Barron, Brian wrote, quote, I'm making a list. Nobody's safe. Lock up your wives. Lock up your daughters. Run for your lives. And he would end up sending a total of 7 letters to Virginia, Sandra's mother. And she immediately gave them all to police unopened, which, good for you, Virginia. Good for you. I would do the same thing. And when police read the letters, they were full of just like graphic and obscene things about Sandra's autopsy and murder and stuff like that. In one of the letters, he included a copy of Sandra's autopsy report, and in the margins, he wrote, quote, happy, happy, joy, joy, read it and weep. She's gone forever. Don't cry over burnt flesh. Calling himself, quote, your worst nightmare. Another letter to Virginia said in part, quote, I'm not sorry for what I did to your daughter. She deserved everything she got. Yeah, isn't that, like, that's so messed up. Good for Virginia on just turning them over to police. I would as well. Maria, remember Maria Day? She received an unprompted letter from a prisoner. And he told her in this letter that he had received her note. And this note included her address and stated that she was looking for someone to, quote, party and get feisty with. And of course, Maria was totally freaked out. She had never wrote to any prisoner or whatnot. And police really thought that Brian was the one who had slipped the prisoner that note. Brian also did an interview with the News Journal as he was sitting in jail awaiting his trial. And in this interview, he claimed not to have anything to do with Sandra's murder. Quote, I'm aware of what happened, but I'm not the one who committed the act. He claimed that a drug-using married man with children was the one that killed Sandra. On December 18th of that same year, Brian was once again denied bail. So remember, like we discussed earlier, right? In Delaware, if you are being held on first-degree murder charges, you are not eligible for bail. However, defendants do have the right to a hearing, and in this hearing, the state has to prove its likelihood of winning the case in order to justify keeping the inmate behind bars before they've gone to trial, you know? And Judge William C. Carpenter Jr. found, quote, "There's every likelihood that the defendant will be found guilty in first-degree murder and should be denied bail." Prosecutors also announced at this time that they were going to be seeking the death penalty. On Thursday, June 27th, 1996, Brian was brought to the Wilmington Municipal Court, good lord, I cannot talk. And he was brought here from where he was awaiting his murder trial at the Delaware Correctional Center near Smyrna. And after the testimony of two witnesses, Brian was found guilty of that offensive touching incident in relation to Francis the bartender. Remember, like he attacked him? Well, he was found guilty of offensive touching in that case, and was also found guilty of failing to appear. Remember, he was supposed to appear back in August of 94 and he didn't. And when asked if he had an excuse for not showing up, Brian just said, quote, "I didn't feel like it." And at this hearing, he was also found guilty of criminal impersonation and marijuana possession. I'm not sure what that was in relation to. Associate Judge John K. Welch sentenced Brian to 1 year and 4 months behind bars to begin immediately, and Brian had to pay Francis $200 in restitution. Now, I think Brian's public defender wanted him to initially plead guilty and take some sort of plea agreement because Brian was overheard arguing with him, and he was heard saying, quote, "Damn it, I ain't pleading nothing." And on Monday, August 19th, 1996, a pre-trial hearing was held to determine how much and what evidence would be presented at Brian's trial. Prosecutors Timothy H. Barron and Thomas A. Peterson said that the jury needed to hear about all those obscene phone calls that Brian had done in the past. And they described those calls as the, quote, "key evidence that led police to Brian." Barron said, quote, "We have a lot of material from which to choose." And they also stated that they were not going to use the letters that Brian wrote from prison as evidence in the trial. But Brian's defense attorneys, Jerome M. Capone and Joseph A. Gabay, argued that the jury would be severely prejudiced against their client if they heard about those obscene phone calls. Capone argued that the jury should just be told that there was information that led police to Brian. The defense also stated that if Brian's confession was going to be allowed at trial, they were going to go with the theory that Brian was on hallucinogenic drugs when he confessed. Quote, "A lot of what Mr. Steckel was telling you was just not true," and this was according to Capone. And though the defense said that they were not going to go for an insanity plea, they did say that they were going to order Brian to submit to several neurological and psychological tests if he was found guilty. And I believe this is so that they could try to avoid the death penalty. On Thursday, August 30th, a hearing was held to determine if the jury would hear about those obscene phone calls. And it was also going to be determined whether or not Brian's confession would be played. Another issue at hand was whether or not the News Journal editor, Herb, was going to have to testify. And the same judge who had denied Brian bail previously, Judge Carpenter, also presided over these hearings. Now, Capone was trying to argue that Brian's confession shouldn't be admissible in court because he spoke to police without a lawyer. However, the prosecutors argued that we have plenty of evidence that shows that Brian waived his Miranda rights and was speaking of his own free will. And in the end, Judge Carpenter ruled that Brian's confession would be admissible. And I guess as these pretrial motions were going on and, the weeks and the months are passing, Brian got a reputation of being a very hostile and difficult client to deal with. I guess he would often change his mind at the last minute about defense strategies, and he kept wish-washing on whether or not he wanted to submit to any of these neurological or psychological tests, and in the end, he refused to submit to any of them. And Brian was also resistant to his defense attorneys bringing up, I guess, the fact that he was sexually abused as a child. At court, he didn't want that brought up at all. Because, they were hoping that would be a mitigating factor, right, in his favor. But Brian was staunchly against this. Jury selection for Brian's trial would begin on Tuesday, September 10th, 1996. And his actual trial would start on Wednesday, September 18th. Now, when opening statements happened, it appeared Capone and Gabay weren't even going to put up a defense. In his opening statement, Gabay just asked the jury to listen to all the testimony, including the cross-examinations, and reminded them that the defense does not have the burden of proof in this case. It was the prosecution. Everyone who attempted to rescue Sandra testified, including Robert and Tammy Johnson. Tammy revealed that a week before Sandra's murder, Brian had actually made a comment about how he should sexually assault her. I guess this was after Tammy and Sandra had an argument about one of her cats. I don't know what, but yeah, after this argument, Brian was like, oh yeah, I should sexually assault her. And Tammy admitted on the stand that at first she did not tell police about this because she felt really guilty. Quote, I didn't want to feel like I had anything to do with it. I just felt like I should have done something after hearing Brian's comment. Her and Robert identified the pantyhose and the screwdriver that were taken from their apartment. And Tammy also stated on the stand that though she smoked weed with Brian on occasion, she thought that she once smelled the odor of crack cocaine or PCP coming from Sandra's apartment. Which is so weird. I'm not even sure if I would know what that smelled like. And we will get into why I bring up that little tidbit that Tammy said. 2 dentists also testified at the trial, testifying to how they could prove that it was Sandra's teeth that had made that bite mark on Brian's finger. Doctors William H. Ulmer and Martin W. Scanlon both testified how they compared the injury on Brian's finger to a wax impression they had taken of Sandra's teeth. Quote, bite marks are very unique and distinctive to the individual, and this was according to Dr. Ulmer. Dr. Scanlon concurred, saying, quote, Sandra Long's teeth made the injuries on Mr. Steckel's hand. Even though, right, we now know in 2024 that this kind of forensic science is not nearly as credible as like DNA, hair, fingerprints, and whatnot, right? I just thought it was so funny because, yeah, I remember in the 90s growing up and like forensic dentistry and they can compare bite marks and, right, we have found out that no, that's actually not like the best science. From what I gather, it's one of those things where if it's the only evidence, like the only hard evidence you have, that's not that great. But if, this bite mark, technology, if it's part of like a bigger piece of evidence that you have, like the other evidence that we've talked about even in this, trial, then it seems to be a little more acceptable. But yeah, I just thought that was super interesting because this is, 96 when they thought, bite marks are going to be just as unique as someone's fingerprint or DNA. And we know that's not true. State medical examiner Robert D. Callery testified about Sandra's autopsy, testified about her injuries and stuff, and this is why I brought up Tammy's thing, testified that PCP had been found in Sandra's bloodstream, but it did not contribute to her death. Isn't that weird? So, I am super, super confused. So, I first came upon the article of Tammy talking about, I smelled crack or PCP one time, and I was like, why would you say that? What the hell? How do you even know what that smells like, And then, a couple of articles later, I found that testimony of Dr. Callery saying, no, PCP was found in her system. That's so weird. And, if she was pregnant, I can't imagine she'd be, taking PCP, right? I don't know. I was curious, did Brian drug her, maybe? I don't know. I thought that was really weird. What do you guys think? And finally, the case went to the jury on Tuesday, October 1st. And this was after the defense called no witnesses and, offered no real case. The only argument they had was that Brian thought he had killed Sandra when he strangled her, and he didn't intentionally set her on fire while she was still alive. That was what they went with. So Judge Carpenter did inform the jury that they could find Brian guilty of first-degree murder, which carried the possibility of the death penalty, second-degree murder, or they could find him guilty or not guilty of manslaughter. The jury ended up deliberating for about 5 hours over the course of 2 days, and they found Brian guilty of all 10 charges. And 3 of those 10 charges were actually 3 individual first-degree murder charges. So when the jury found him guilty of all these charges, including those 3, they believed he committed 3 crimes in killing Sandra. Intentionally killing her, right? Killing her while fleeing immediately after sexually assaulting her, and killing her while committing arson, right? And the same jury would meet up the next week on October 8th to decide Brian's sentence. And they were left with between life with no possibility of parole or the death penalty. And the jury's decision did not have to be unanimous. And ultimately though, Judge Carpenter would be the one to ultimately sentence Brian. In Delaware, the jury they recommend a sentence to the judge, but ultimately the judge has the power and the say-so of what the sentence is. At his penalty phase hearing, the defense tried to argue that Brian became who he was, quote, not by choice, but by tragic circumstance. Know that he was not born bad to the bone. They presented evidence that Brian was sexually abused as a child, so I guess Brian did let them present that. They also presented evidence that Brian had exhibited emotional and psychological problems as early as 12 years old, and they presented evidence of all the time he had spent in several juvenile facilities. And they also pointed to those letters that Brian sent, but specifically the letters he sent to Virginia, as like clear-cut evidence that Brian was clearly mentally unwell. Marlene tearfully testified at Brian's penalty phase hearing, and she read a letter that Brian had sent her on July 26th. And it read in part, quote, I hate myself and I hate what I did to her, Sandy. I pity Sandy. I lost myself and I took it out on her. I hope God spares my soul so I can go to heaven. He also wrote in the letter that he was sexually abused as a child and, quote, did the same to Sandy that was done to me. And I guess as Marlene was testifying / reading this letter, Brian suddenly had an outburst when he stood up and shouted shut up at his mom. He'd been quiet and stoic this whole time, but this was the only outburst he had when his mother was reading this letter. The jury was taken out of the courtroom while, everything settled down, and then Marlene continued her testimony without any other further interruptions. Tina, Brian's sister, also testified, saying that her brother had always been in trouble. Quote, all my life, I've always stuck by him. I love him. He'll always be my brother. Gabay and Capone tried to paint a picture of Brian having deep psychological problems, having neurological problems as well. And they argued that because, he's so mentally unwell that he should be avoided the death penalty, But I guess Brian wasn't having anything of what they were saying. Against his attorney's advice, Brian took the stand at his penalty phase hearing. And he was refuting that there was anything wrong with him psychologically, emotionally, or neurologically. Quote, my mother provided a loving home. I don't think I have any neurological problems. I relatively understood life and made my own decisions and choices. And he said the jury was right to convict him. Quote, I did sexually assault her. I did beat her up. And I did start her apartment on fire. I have no explanation. The murder was unprovoked. The murder was selfish. I didn't know how to say I'm sorry. How do you tell someone's family you're sorry for strangling them? How do you do such a thing? I don't know. I ask you people to hold me accountable for what I did. I've gotten away with so much in my life that I stand here today. I know I deserve to die for what I did to Sandy. I'm prepared to give up my life because I deserve to. I know what I did was wrong. It was selfish and despicable. And I guess he went on for 20 minutes apologizing to Virginia and saying that he'd been sexually abused as a child. Quote, for the last 14 years, I've run away from my problems. And prosecutors declined to cross-examine him. The defense also brought forth a Pennsylvania psychiatrist. His name was Dr. Stephen Mechanic. And he had, spent some time with Brian and examined him. And he concluded that Brian did have neurological problems and had an unstable childhood that left him with ADD and an antisocial personality disorder. On cross-examination, Brian asked Dr. Mechanic if he believed Brian to be dangerous, to which he answered yes. However, he refused to agree with Barron that some people are just born evil. Quote, he was born with a brain that didn't work right in some respects and had a damaging childhood environment, adding that with proper medication and therapy, Brian, could be helped. Neurologist Dr. S. Charles Bean also testified, pretty much concurring with everything that Dr. Mechanic had said, that, with his troubled childhood and already being born with maybe a brain that didn't work well, as they said, mixed with, substance abuse, it all contributed to why they were here that day. And he also concurred with Mechanic's diagnosis of ADD and an antisocial personality disorder. In closing arguments, the defense pleaded with the jury to not give Brian the death penalty because he had been born with neurological problems. And these problems were only exacerbated by his turbulent childhood and substance abuse issues and stuff like that. The prosecution, meanwhile, pointed to all the letters that Brian had sent from behind bars, even those ones to Virginia, saying that this proved that he wasn't remorseful at all. And he knew very well what he was doing. The defense argued that the letters proved Brian's instability. And on October 17th, in a vote of 11-1, the jury recommended the death penalty for Brian. Judge Carpenter said that he would give the jury's recommendation great weight, and Virginia, who did want Brian to get the death penalty, said of the jury's recommendation, quote, "I don't want him to have the chance to escape, to do to somebody else what he did to Sandy and to all of us. Sandra went through such a terrible, terrible ordeal." And she also went out of her way to say that she felt a lot of sympathy for Marlene, Brian's mother, and like all of his family, and she didn't blame them for what Brian had done. Greg, remember Greg Long, he was described as Sandra's former husband. I thought that was a weird phrasing, not ex-husband, but former husband. So that's why I was confused on if they were married when she passed away or what. But Gregory also attended the trial and the penalty phase and all that. And he said after the jury's recommendation, quote, "There are no winners. Everybody's a loser in a case like this." And absolutely, absolutely. On Wednesday, January 8th, 1997, Judge Carpenter took the jury's recommendation and sentenced Brian to the death penalty. Brian smiled when the verdict was read, and his execution date was scheduled for April, which of course would get delayed. By his own request, Brian's family did not attend the sentencing hearing, but Virginia did, and she said afterwards, quote, "I was shocked and sickened. My child was tortured and degraded before being set on fire." She stated that though she met Marlene outside the courthouse and, quote, "felt pity for her, she felt the death penalty is, quote, most justly deserved." Capone had tried to argue to Judge Carpenter that, quote, "Sandy Long died a tragic and horrible death. This was a tragic and horrible crime, but Brian Steckel led a tragic and horrible life for reasons that were largely out of his control." And while the judge did not disagree from these points from the defense, he felt that the factors like favoring the death penalty, the aggravating factors, outweighed the factors revolving around Brian's upbringing, the mitigating factors, right? Brian's conviction and death sentence were affirmed by the Delaware Supreme Court on May 22nd, 1998, and in a hearing to schedule his execution date the next month, Judge Carpenter asked Brian if he had anything to say. But Brian only looked at his watch and said, quote, "The Phillies are on at 3:20. And the judge said that he would not dally, and he set Brian's execution date, and it was set for September. But Gabay asked for a stay of execution as they were planning on filing some federal appeals. They hadn't gone through their federal appeals yet. Barron did not object, and Judge Carpenter granted the request. In October of that same year, Brian's execution date, which Carpenter was prepared to set for February, was once again stayed. And this was because Brian stated that he was going to appeal the state Supreme Court's decision affirming his death sentence. He also stated that he was going to file a federal appeal, and he was going to request new attorneys. And this was so he could pursue an appeal that their work was inefficient and incompetent. And Judge Carpenter granted Brian's request and said that he would soon assign a new attorney to him. He asked if Brian had anything else to say, and I guess he just nodded towards Gabay and Capone and said, quote, "Make sure these guys get paid." Afterwards, Gabay told the press, quote, "It's all part of the game. We're all big boys. Our feelings aren't hurt." And he stated that he had actually informed Brian that this was an option, that he could attack their competency at the trial as a way to appeal. So Brian's appeal was brought before the Delaware Superior Court, where he was represented by new defense attorneys, Joseph M. Bernstein and John Deckers. However, in his tradition of being a difficult client, Brian refused to be cooperative with Dr. John O'Brien, and he was a medical expert that his attorneys had hired. So since Brian didn't want to submit to any interviews or anything like that with Dr. O'Brien, he instead just went through all the case files and all the information that there was on Brian and his upbringing, the trial, and all that stuff. And Dr. O'Brien agreed that Brian did have an antisocial personality disorder, but he also diagnosed him as having traits of narcissistic personality disorder. Dr. O'Brien stated that he believed these traits is what caused Brian to exaggerate his criminal history and even exaggerate details of Sandra's murder. And Bernstein and Deckers argued before the court that Brian's previous defense was ineffective at his trial because they did not present this narcissistic disorder traits, that he had these traits associated with this disorder at his penalty phase hearing. But on August 31st, 2001, Brian's appeal was rejected, and of course he appealed that, and it eventually made its way to the Delaware Supreme Court, who affirmed the Superior Court's decision on April 11th, 2002. Brian also tried tried to appeal for the writ of habeas corpus, but those appeals were denied by both the U.S. District Court for the District of Delaware and the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. And on April 13th, 2004, his petition for federal habeas corpus was also denied. And on Thursday, August 11th, 2005, Brian, who was practically out of appeals at this point, was once again attempting to appeal his conviction. And this time, he was coming at it by fighting the constitutionality of Delaware's death penalty. So Bernstein and Deckers argued in Delaware Supreme Court that executing their client would be a miscarriage of justice. And that was because the state's death penalty law was unconstitutional. Lawrence C. Myers was chief of the appeals division for the Delaware Department of Justice, and he argued that the law was just and constitutional, and Brian's death should be scheduled. Now, apparently when they were arguing this, many thought this was a preview of what Thomas Capano was going to argue. You remember that case, right? We went into that case in great deal. And he also tried this, right? Fighting the constitutionality of Delaware's death penalty. Bernstein also argued in front of the court that the jury should have been informed before the sentencing that if they found Brian guilty of the sexual assault and the other felonies related to the murder, that this would automatically make him eligible for the death penalty. And he was arguing that the jury was not informed of this, and they should have been. Bernstein argued that the lack of clarity on this point misled jurors because Carpenter told them that their role in the sentencing phase was merely to advise him of what to do. Merely advising him on whether Brian should be locked up for life or killed. So apparently, jury trials in first-degree murder cases in the state of Delaware are broken into two parts in regards to state law. So first, the jurors must decide, of course, right, if the defendant is guilty or not guilty. And if they find the defendant guilty, the jurors then must answer two additional questions. Whether the murder involved at least one aggravating circumstance, such as killing during a sexual assault or a robbery, and whether those aggravating circumstances outweigh the mitigating factors, such as the defendant's upbringing. So apparently, in some cases like Brian's, the jury has to answer yes to the first question if they have found the defendant guilty. Specifically, if they found him guilty of another felony related to the murder. And I guess a lot of Bernstein's argument relied on a 2002 Supreme Court case, and that's where they struck down the death penalty laws in Arizona and 4 other states. Remember, we've covered that too. And again, I believe in the Capano video. And if you remember, they were struck down because judges ultimately had the final say-so on what a defendant's sentencing was, right? And the Supreme Court found that unconstitutional, and the case was Ring v. Arizona. So in order to comply with the new ruling, Delaware had changed their law in June of 2002, so that now, after June 2002, the juries have to be unanimous in their decision for the death penalty. And Bernstein, if you'll remember, was representing Thomas Capano at the same time, acknowledged that this Supreme Court decision did not generally apply to convictions prior to 2002. Like, it wasn't like one of those retroactive laws. But Bernstein was arguing that this Supreme Court decision can be applied when a miscarriage of justice is involved. And Myers argued that even if the Ring decision was relevant to this case, there was no error in how the trial court applied the death penalty. He also argued that there was no reason to believe that the jury took their job less seriously because they would have to weigh a death sentence by finding that the murder had aggravating factors. The next month, in September, the court reaffirmed Brian's sentence and rejected Bernstein's arguments. And the court couldn't even get into the merit of Bernstein's arguments because they were saying procedurally speaking, Brian's out of appeals. He can't come at this with a new strategy. So they didn't even really get into the merits of Bernstein's arguments. However, they did include a footnote in their decision that implied Bernstein's arguments still didn't really carry weight. Quote, "We note that this court has held that Delaware's hybrid form of sentencing is not contrary to the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution." The court also stated that these kind of arguments have to be made within 3 years of the final conviction, and Brian's conviction was final in 1998. So his options, on this type of front, had expired in 2001. Finally, on September 30th, 2005, Judge Carpenter set Brian's execution date for November 4th, and he ordered that his execution was to be witnessed by at least 10 people, including an adult member of Sandra's family, which I thought was weird, or someone designated by her family. Karen, one of Sandra's sisters, stated that she wasn't sure if she was going to attend, but she said another family member might. Quote, "I don't care if he lives or dies, I just want people to remember Sandra. She was beautiful, an angel." On Wednesday, October 12th, Bernstein Bernstein and Deckers filed motions for a stay of execution, arguing that Brian needed more time to exercise his, appeal options. They said their client had 90 days from the state Supreme Court's decision on September 7th to file an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, which would mean Brian could possibly be dead before his case was heard. They also stated in the motion that no federal court had heard their arguments about the constitutionality of Delaware's state death penalty. 2 days later, Judge Carpenter rejected all of their motions, writing that the State Board of Parole and the State Board of Pardons had agreed to look at Brian's case before his execution date, and said that SCOTUS was unlikely to take up this case anyway. And if, they did happen to take up the case, they of course would order their own stay of execution. Quote, "The court finds that due to the procedural context in which the defendant is now seeking relief, that there is no basis to reasonably find that at least 4 justices of the United States Supreme Court would vote to grant certiorari to hear the case, or that there is a significant possibility that the decision of the Delaware Supreme Court would be reversed. Therefore, this court also finds there is no irreparable harm to the defendant in denying his motion at this time." Yeah, the word was very hard to say. I tried to look up 3 or 4 things of how to pronounce it, and everyone had a different pronunciation. But anyway, so Bernstein and Deckers filed an appeal of Judge Carpenter's decision, but the state Supreme Court denied it. And they ordered for the November execution date to go forward. On Friday, October 28th, Brian went before the State Board of Pardons to see if they would commute his sentence. Brian's family, including his now 12-year-old daughter, Marlene, his mother, and his brother Robert were there. And for 90 minutes, his mother, his brother, his family, they spoke in his defense, with Robert recalling opening Christmas presents with his little brother, playing with him, telling the board that his brother was not a monster. Quote, "He's a son, a father, a brother, a friend. To me, he's my little brother." Brian's aunt, Nancy Redinger, said, quote, "You could not find a more gentle child." Vicky Steckel, which was Brian's sister-in-law, said that Brian shouldn't be executed because state-sanctioned murder is wrong. Quote, "Murder plus murder equals murder. What you are doing is wrong." Marlene insisted that her son had changed since being in prison, and that he wasn't the same person as he was back in 1994. And none of his family tried to excuse his actions or anything. They seemed to be coming at it more on, the death penalty is, wrong in general, They said Brian's death would result in 2 grieving families. And even though his family and friends had begged for a commute, when Brian stood before the board, he told them he wasn't there, quote, "to beg for a bunch of strangers to save my life. I didn't come here to make no excuses." He said he had come to address Sandra's family, who were in attendance. He told them, quote, "I'm sorry for what I did. Your daughter didn't deserve to die the way she did," saying his actions were repulsive and selfish. He apologized for the letters he had written to Virginia, saying that he had copies of these letters, and he read through them periodically. And when he read them, he wondered why he did what he did. Quote, "I don't have a lot of answers. I was an angry person. I felt ugly inside." He stated that he wished he could bring Sandra back. Quote, "I want these people to know if I have to die November 4th, I'm ready to die." And after he was done, I guess his daughter left the room crying. Virginia just cried when it was her turn to speak. She held up a picture of Sandra, saying how the murder had really shattered her family. She said that it had sent many relatives into long bouts of depression. She blamed the stress and depression over Sandra's murder as the reason Sandra's father passed away in 1997, and blamed the same thing for her brother dying earlier that year in 2005. She said they struggled each day, quote, "waiting for Brian to get the death penalty," saying she herself still grappled with anger, loss, emptiness. Quote, "I'm pleading with the Board of Pardons to give us some peace and closure. I don't need any more letters or to see any more articles in the newspaper. I want to be able to go on living knowing justice has been served." Jean said that when her sister was murdered, quote, "the life went out of my family. All this pain has to end." She had more harsh words, saying that it wasn't a question of whether or not Brian deserved the death penalty. Quote, "By any means he should. The real question is, what are we waiting for?" The board took an hour to deny commuting Brian's sentence, and the execution was set for November 4th. A few days later, Vicky and Robert did an interview with the paper, and Vicky said her and Robert's 7-year-old daughter, so Brian's niece, was in tears after the hearing. Quote, "And last Friday night after the pardon board, that child cried herself to sleep, asking why, with so many people sitting in jail, do they have to kill my uncle?" And his only chance at staying the execution at this point would be if 4 of the 9 Supreme Court justices decided to hear the case. Which, of course, they didn't. In the days leading to the execution, there were many local articles written about the case. And there were interviews with people like Sergeant Downs, Evan Gabay, remember, Brian's former defense attorney, who said his client had, quote, "all the triggers, all the mechanisms, early in his life that turn a person violent." He thought Brian liked the attention that his crime brought him, and he believed that his behavior was, in some twisted way, some way for, like, Brian to exert some sort of control. Quote, he liked people to be afraid of him, adding that he was angry and had delusions of grandeur. I guess Brian thought that he was going to own a professional basketball team one day, despite not even graduating high school. Gabay even said that he did believe Brian would kill again if he hadn't been caught. But though he admitted Brian was violent, he believed his former client wasn't a threat to anyone behind bars. Quote, outside, he is a dangerous guy. Very dangerous. He's just good at being in jail. Pennsylvania State Police stated they still wanted to talk to Brian, specifically about Francis's disappearance. They wanted to talk to him before his execution because, her case was still unsolved at this point in time. But every time Pennsylvania detectives had gone to the prison to try to talk to Brian, he wouldn't meet with them. The day before he was set to be executed, Marlene and Robert visited Brian for about 2 hours. Marlene was too emotional to, give an interview afterwards, but Robert gave an interview. And he told the press his brother's last words to him, quote, I love you and please take care of my mother. And he said he was sorry. He told Robert to give final instructions to his daughter. He gave his brother a rosary to give to her and a promise to write her one last final letter. Robert said he thinks about Sandra every day. Quote, we grieve for both families. We don't know if that will ever be clear what was going on in his head. He said he had visited his brother about 6 to 8 times in the last month, always reminiscing about good times. Robert said that to him, Brian will always be that 10-year-old little brother engaging in snowball fights and walking carefully through the cemetery to go sledding down Jump Park Hill. Quote, he would say, never walk across grave sites. It's improper. That's the side of Brian I wish people could see. I don't think they will ever see that. He said during their last visit, the two talked a lot about food, about their favorites. Brian talked about, Spam and Klondike bars and how he liked to eat the Klondike bar chocolate coating away and then put the ice cream in a root beer to make a float. Quote, he's sad he has to die. He knows he did something wrong and he feels like this is my punishment and I'm ready to die. Brian told his brother that he had made peace with his fate. Quote, would you really want to sit around looking at yourself in the mirror for 40, 50 years knowing what you've done? He also said that Brian requested that his family not attend the execution. Quote, our family is going to feel the same loss for the rest of our lives. But he acknowledged at least their family was able to have, Thanksgivings, Christmases, birthdays, and that kind of stuff with Brian, even if it was through partitioned glass. Quote, we could at least talk to our brother. We had that and they didn't. Of course, referring to Sandra's family. Brian David Steckel's last words were, quote, I would like to tell all the people who supported me all these years and sacrificed for me. I want to say I'm sorry for the cruel things I did. I am not the same man I was when I came to jail. I changed. I'm a better man. I love you. I'm sorry these people had to see this. Take care of Mom. Tell my daughter I said no excuses. It's time for me to go. I'm sorry. Tell Mom I'm sorry for the 25 years of hell I put her through. She deserved better. That's all. I love you. Bye. He said he talked about how much he would miss his mother and his daughter, whom he had only just recently met. She was like an infant and had just been born when he was thrown in jail, And his final ever statement was, quote, okay, gotta go. I love you. Time to get out of here. The journey away begins. I walked in here without a fight and I accept my punishment. It is time to go. I love you people. I'm at peace. And Brian David Steckel was pronounced dead at 12:21 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on November 4th, 2005. And he died by lethal injection at the Delaware Correctional Center. He was the first person executed in the state of Delaware since May of 2001 and was the 14th overall person executed in Delaware since the reestablishment of their death penalty in 1992. His last meal was a cheesesteak, coleslaw, and a Pepsi. Marlene said that she believed a combination of mental illness and drug addiction had taken over her son. Quote, I do feel the drugs and alcohol took my son off to a deeper end. Brian's cousin, who was at the execution, Mary Kolsnick, said her family had suffered a loss. Quote, is this going to bring closure to anyone? I don't think so. She said that his remains would be cremated and given to Marlene. Now, after Brian's death, many came out with critiques of how Brian's execution had gone. And one of the critiques was it took an unusually long time for Brian to die. 12 minutes. At one point, Brian even looked at the warden and commented, quote, I didn't think it would take this long. Fordham University law professor Deborah Deno, who is a death penalty expert, said that based on descriptions of Brian's execution, there seemed to be a lot of failures in injecting the drugs. Quote, it sounds like the drugs weren't getting through or were taking a long time. She explained how 3 drugs are used in an execution. One sedates the inmate, the second paralyzes them, and the third causes cardiac arrest. And Professor Deno said that based on what witnesses described, it seemed that the sedative and the paralyzing agent did not reach Brian properly. quote, within 10 minutes passing and he's still waiting to die and the drugs are not reacting, that is pretty bad. And she also said if the paralytic drug had been administered properly to him, he wouldn't have convulsed before he died. And witnesses claim to have heard several audible clicks during the 12 minutes after Brian finished his last statement and when he was injected. And then the state was saying that those clicks were like from the lethal injection machine or something. But yeah, Professor Deno was saying that like, yeah, the fact that those 12 minutes passed and in those 12 minutes, Brian was lucid, he was talking more, that's why he had kind of several last statements, as it were, that was clearly a sign that something was wrong. However, the Delaware Department of Corrections spokeswoman Beth Welch insisted that nothing had gone wrong with the execution. And the only reason that it took 12 minutes for Brian to die was because the warden was giving Brian extra time to say his last words. And of course, no investigation was ever conducted. But there was a federal class action lawsuit by attorneys representing Delaware's death penalty inmates. And these attorneys were from the Federal Community Defender's Office in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And so the class action suit was basically saying that Delaware's lethal injection protocol and all that, it wasn't up to snuff. The class action lawsuit also tried to argue that the use of lethal injection was cruel and unusual punishment, and they pointed to Brian's execution taking 12 minutes, along with like some other factors that indicated like that something was not going correctly with Brian's execution. They point to the fact that Brian convulsed and snorted like right before he died. That showed that like obviously the drugs weren't administered properly. And they showed like a lot of other things to show that pretty much the state's like lethal injection process and like how they did all that, it was just a joke. It wasn't up to snuff and it was unconstitutional. So apparently this class action lawsuit, it stemmed from an April 2008 Supreme Court case. And in that case, the Supreme Court said that Kentucky's use of lethal injection was constitutional as long it was carried out correctly. And the defender's office in their suit was saying that Delaware's lethal injection process did not comply with the Supreme Court's decision. And they argued that Delaware's lethal injection process was vastly different than Kentucky's. And the state argued that, like, yeah, our process is different from Kentucky's. Our process is more stringent than Kentucky's. They tried to claim that Delaware's procedures leaves even less room for error compared to Kentucky. And they said this despite a third of Delaware's executions had not gone correctly. And this prompted a federal district judge, Sue L. Robinson, to put immediate hold on all executions in Delaware as they sorted through all of this. And so a stay of Delaware's executions was made in May of 2006 as all of this wound its way through the courts. In a court filing in June 2008 that was related to the federal class action lawsuit, details of a deposition that was held going over Brian's execution was released. So in the deposition, a member of the execution team known as John Doe 3 said he didn't care if the execution had caused Brian unnecessary duress or harm. And that was because Brian, quote, didn't appear to care about the pain and suffering of his victims. So John Doe 3 had been retired for several years by the time they were at Brian's execution, and they were no longer licensed to practice as a paramedic or an EMT, and was one of the people directly responsible for setting up the intravenous tubes that should have delivered the drugs to Brian. So it was found that the primary IV connected to Brian had failed, and so the execution team had to switch to their backup. But the execution team had failed to re-administer the anesthetic, and instead they only injected the other two drugs. And in January of 2009, final arguments were held before it was believed the federal lawsuit would be dismissed. It was described as the last legal step before the dismissal, and that was because at this point in time, all the sides had agreed that Delaware had changed their protocol, and they had changed it to comply with the Supreme Court decision. But the attorneys representing the death row inmates wanted to make one last argument, and that was no matter how good Delaware's rules were, like no matter how good these protocols that you had in place were, the state had shown numerous times that they could not be trusted to carry out executions humanely and correctly. And they said, we know this because they haven't had a correct execution. One of the attorneys representing the inmates, Michael Wiseman, said, quote, in every one of the lethal injection executions since the death penalty was restored in 1992, the state has violated its older, more lax written guidelines. And he argued this fact made Delaware significantly different than Kentucky, specifically the Supreme Court case surrounding Kentucky, because Kentucky didn't have as much of like a history as Delaware did. And so, Kentucky didn't really have a lot of track record to evaluate, but Wiseman was saying Delaware did, and that track record proved that you couldn't trust the state. Quote, "The record shows that Delaware has never conducted an execution by lethal injection that met the requirements of the then existing protocol. The plaintiffs are unaware of any other lethal injection case that has proceeded to summary judgment with as extensive a record of maladministration and errors as this one." So in the 13 lethal injections that the state had given, all had the wrong dosage of drugs given, had an execution team member that was not properly trained or was even properly qualified, and had team member or members who were never shown a copy of written detailed instructions of how the execution should go. And Wiseman pointed to Brian's execution as one where the state failed on all 3 counts. Now, the state argued they vigorously disputed the characterizations of error that Wiseman described, yet they didn't argue any of his points. They didn't argue with any of his statistics or anything like that. On Wednesday, March 11th, 2009, Judge Robinson dismissed the federal lawsuit. However, she did not lift the stay of executions in the state of Delaware. She said that since the state had adopted the new lethal injection procedures to comply with the Supreme Court order, there was no longer any material issues to dispute with this lawsuit. However, she still held that the stay of executions would still be there just until all the appeals related to this matter and all that went through the courts. Wiseman stated that they were going to appeal the decision to dismiss the suit, and they were going to appeal it to the U.S. Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And Wiseman said that they were disappointed that the lawsuit wasn't able to go to trial, but said the plaintiffs were, quote, "gratified Judge Robinson found that there were serious errors in Delaware's history of execution by lethal injection." And Judge Robinson had actually cited Brian's execution as one of many examples of Delaware's failure. And she cited Brian's execution because not only was it the most recent, it was the most egregious because it had failed on all 3 fronts. Quote, "While the IV team tried to fix the problem, Steckel started talking, an indication that he was not yet anesthetized. She conceded that the plaintiffs had, quote, demonstrated that executions by lethal injection had been carried out in Delaware with a casualness and procedure that cannot be tolerated in future. But she said that such casualness shouldn't be held against the state because, quote, societal norms have changed, which raised the expectations of how lethal injections should be carried out. She also said in her ruling that executions don't necessarily have to be painless in order to be constitutional. And she commented on the irony of considering risk of harm during an execution, quote, "In the context at the bar, the term harmful referred to above is not death, since that is the goal of lethal injection." In December of that year, the suit was held in front of the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, and it was a 3-judge panel made up of Judges D. Michael Fisher, Thomas M. Hardiman, and Franklin S. Van Antwerpen. So if they had upheld Robinson's ruling and the Supreme Court didn't take up the case, the state would then have a clear path for executions again. However, Wiseman and the other attorneys thought that a recent case out of Ohio might help them. So if the circuit court ruled the way Wiseman wanted, they would kick the case back to district court, keeping Delaware's executions halted, right, as this went through the court system. So in Ohio, when this case was going to be heard, I guess that state had successfully executed an inmate with a 1-drug lethal injection, not this 3-cocktail mix that Delaware and a lot of other states had. And the plaintiffs had made an argument about using this 1-shot method and pointed to the fact that Ohio had successfully done it. Well, that means that everyone should adopt this. They were also arguing that Delaware lacked a plan B in case an execution, something didn't go right. And this was despite the fact that the Supreme Court decision regarding Kentucky lethal injection made no stipulations about them needing a plan B. But Ohio had actually encountered this very same problem. So they had tried to execute Rommel Broom, and I guess they tried locating a vein in him for 2 hours before they gave up. And I guess after that, Ohio was currently reassessing their injection procedures and all that. So that was what that's what the attorneys representing the inmates were trying to use, what had come out of Ohio. And the state argued, of course, what happens in Ohio has no relevance to here in Delaware. That shouldn't even be something that we compare. And they were arguing, of course, that Robinson's ruling should be upheld and Delaware should be allowed to execute people again. In February of 2010, the circuit court upheld Delaware's death penalty, paving the way for executions once again. In their 47-page opinion, Judge Fisher, writing for them, wrote, quote, "The record before us reflects an occasional blitheness on Delaware's part that, while perhaps not unconstitutional, gives us great pause. We remind Delaware not only of its constitutional obligation, but also of its moral obligation to carry out executions with the degree of seriousness and respect that the state-administered termination of human life demands. After this, Gabay commented to the papers, and he believed that since the execution problems that Delaware had kind of like paled in comparison to what else was going on at the country at that time, he didn't think the Supreme Court was going to take up the case and that executions were going to go forward. So yeah, Delaware continued doing executions, even doing executions when the drug cocktail that they need for it was hard to come by. Yeah, there was a time where it was extremely hard to come by these lethal injection cocktails. And so a lot of states had like a pause on all their lethal injection procedures. But Delaware, I guess, they had some sort of insider like deal where they were able to get these drugs when no other state could. And I guess it was some sleazebag working in the state who had pharmaceutical ties. And yeah, that's how they were able to get the drugs and continue killing people. In March of 2013, a repeal of Delaware's death penalty did pass the state Senate, but it passed by a narrow margin, and it failed to receive enough votes to clear the House Judiciary Committee, because if it clears that, then it receives a full debate and vote in the House, but it didn't pass the Judiciary Committee. But in April of 2015, for the second time in 3 years, Delaware Senate once again voted to repeal the death penalty. And again, it was by a narrow margin. It was 11-9 vote. And so as this was getting ready to be argued in the Delaware House, then Governor of Delaware, Jack Markle, announced that if the repeal passed the House, he would sign it into law. He wouldn't veto it. But once again, in a narrow 6-5 vote, in May of that year, the committee declined to send it to the House. However, in January of 2016, the bill had another chance in the House when House leadership unexpectedly released the proposal to the full House for a full vote. Representative Larry Mitchell, who was a Democrat from Ellesmere, he chaired the Judiciary Committee, and he thought the bill deserved a full hearing in the House, despite vehemently being against it. And in February, it failed in a 23-16 vote. And apparently one of the no votes was like a strategic vote, so that a lawmaker who supported the repeal could, I guess, file a motion to reconsider the bill. And during the same time, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in what was described as outlying death penalty practices as unconstitutional, and this was an 8-1 vote. So the specific practice was Florida's death penalty practice, and the Supreme Court had ruled that practices like Florida's gave too much power to judges and not juries when it came to sentencing. And both Florida and Alabama had practices much like Delaware, where the jury just sort of recommends a sentence. And so what do you think this Supreme Court case did, right? It caused a bunch of questions in Delaware, and once again, Delaware's executions were halted. The Delaware Supreme Court then agreed to hear 5 key arguments about this issue. And I guess they were going to hear it from both sides, of course. I guess the court was going to use a test case, and it would be known as Ralph v. State, and it challenged the constitutionality of Delaware's death penalty law. So an inmate named Benjamin Ralph was up for the death penalty for shooting a classmate, and this case would end up being the test case for the specific issue. And on August 2nd, 2016, in a 148-page ruling, the Delaware Supreme Court decreed that Delaware's death penalty process did indeed give too much power to judges and not juries. And they also pointed to the fact that the jury's decision didn't have to be unanimous as also unconstitutional. And they also ruled that the only chance at fixing this was to toss this issue to the General Assembly. This also meant that all the death penalty cases that were currently pending in the state of Delaware could no longer be tried as death penalty cases. And on August 15th, the Attorney General said that they were not going to appeal the Supreme Court's decision, Delaware Supreme Court's decision. And on December 15th, the court also ruled that the Ralph decision also applied to the 13 inmates who were currently sitting on Delaware's death row. And so all of their sentences were commuted to life without parole. And then in May of 2017, I guess the House Judiciary Committee voted to restore the death penalty. And I guess when one representative asked, like, well, what method are we going to use to execute people then? The bill's lead sponsor, State Representative Steve Smick, he couldn't answer. The state's public defender then clarified that it would either be hanging or lethal injection, and it was due to some old state statute. The same state representative then asked if Delaware even had enough drugs to execute all the inmates, and no one could answer him. And in the end, though nobody could answer these important questions, the committee voted to restore the death penalty, citing that hanging was still a viable option. And that is the latest I could find about Delaware's death penalty, and I believe at this point in time, there's currently no valid way for the state of Delaware to impose death sentences. And apparently the last execution in Delaware was in 2012. And wow, that was the case of Brian David Steckel. Isn't that sad? So I have many thoughts. So personally, like I am not a fan of the death penalty. I'm not going to go into all my reasons, but there's a myriad of reasons why I'm against the death penalty personally. So yeah, of course I wouldn't send Brian to death. I think what makes this so sad is that, again, like I don't know a lot of details because we don't know a lot about his background, but clearly he was born, with some sort of neurological problems, and apparently it didn't have the best childhood. And I think it's just so sad because I feel like Brian is representative of like a lot of broken people in this country that need help. And, we don't care about each other in this country. We don't care about people. And because, we as a society, as a country, just don't care, Sandra lost her life, I'm kind of with Gabe, where I think Brian probably was less dangerous behind bars. And yeah, it's so sad. Like, Gregory had it right, dude. There are no winners in this case. There's none whatsoever. I think it's sad. I do think it's sad that Brian died, and like he didn't even like get to die in a way that should be like the way, like if you're going to do it, right? Like it needs to be carried out humanely, because that's what separates us from like murderers. That's what it should be anyway, right? Is that we are better than them. So we, show compassion and mercy. And so like, yeah, if, you're going to kill someone, at least do it humanely, Yeah, I think it's sad. Poor Sandra, dude, died in such a horrible way. That is awful. Burning. Oh my God. It's so terrible. Thank you to Tyler Manter for suggesting this case. You always throw me some Delaware cases. You must be from Delaware. This was, yeah, definitely an interesting case. I am totally curious to hear like what you guys think. What do you think of Brian? Like, should he be killed? Do you believe in the death penalty? Like, yeah, I'm totally curious. Let me know your thoughts. So yeah, I guess I will let you guys go. Hope you enjoyed the new set here. A little Star Wars for the month of May. Got all the ColourPop palettes. I even used the ColourPop Star Wars palette, the blue, for today's look. And I used the Star Wars lipstick from ColourPop. Alrighty, well, take care. I'll see you in 2 weeks for another case. And yeah, I hope until we meet again, you just take care of yourself out there. Just keep living your best life. You do you. Remember, don't be a dick. Leave a little sparkle wherever you go. Alrighty, guys, I will see you in 2 weeks. Have a wonderful 2 weeks. Bye-bye.